Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to the Post 57 Interregnum. This is the end of our post-endings trilogy that recommenced our series, and thank you so much for hanging with me once more. Can I say though, with all these video series I've done for about the last 10 years, this has been the most recurrent request for me to explore the Interregnum. And I want to do a big shout out and dedication to my mate Leo. Hi Leo, you are the best. And the Interregnum matters. It matters to our personal lives, it matters to our professional lives. The Interregnum is a lens through which we recalibrate and understand intellectual history. But what is the Interregnum? Let's look at it. At its most basic, the Interregnum is a gap, a break, or a rupture in a governmental or social order. The word has both a science fictional but also historical engagement through time, but it was used to describe the space between the reign of monarchs. So the Latin inter, meaning between, and regnum, reign. Pretty straightforward. So interregnum comes from Roman law in particular, attributing power temporarily to the patres, that is, members of the Senate, when the rex, the king, is not present. So hung parliaments and caretaker governments both are part of interregna. And the period in the United States between the election of a new president and the former president finishing their particular candidature, that's also described as an interregnum. Right, so most famously in popular culture, where most of you have probably heard of the word interregnum, it comes from Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, which takes place in the 25th millennium. That is a galactic interregnum. That's certainly the first time as a kid I'd heard the word. Babylon 5 featured an interregnum during the Centauri Republic when the assassinated emperor didn't declare an heir. Ooh. And of course Tolkien's Steward years. The Steward era was a 969 length of years of an interregnum. So from these popular cultural examples, we can see that the word interregnum also has an edge to it. It's about chaos, instability, confusion. We're all a bit unsettled. Put simply, at its most basic, the interregnum is blocked when we use a phrase like, "the king is dead, God save the king." Think about how often we hear, the king is dead, God save the king. And the reason we have that maxim or that slogan is to actively block the emergence of an interregnum. You see, we have the argument that when a king dies, automatically another king is immediately in place. But of course, that's simply not true. It's simply not the case. And there is always this gap, this weird, wonderful, confusing period in time where we have succession wars, foreign invasions, failed states. Failed states happen in interregna. Now, Henrique Carvalho and Alan Norrie, wonderful scholars, describe the interregnum as, quote, between the old, the broken promise of the liberal enlightenment, and a new, a world that is emancipated across a variety of social registers, generating a variety of morbid symptoms in our dystopic present. End of quote. Great phrase. Morbid symptoms. Well, we've hit the prologue. Now's the time for the main gig. Antonio Gramsci's interregnum has a precise origin and a precise definition. It emerged from his more general writings about the crisis in Italy at the end of the 1920s and the start of the 1930s. This is what Gramsci described as, quote, the crisis of authority, end of quote. Expectations are suspended. Hope is parked. Violence, including semiotic violence, is used to sustain and create some sort of social order. But this violence fails. At these times, there's no order, there's no clear answers, there's no normative framework through which to construct an ethical conversation. So the interregnum, think of it as a wall or a blockage to outcomes and answers to difficult questions. Gramsci developed the concept of the interregnum in his famous prison notebooks, and you'll find it particularly in notebook 3 from 1930. So what we're dealing with at this point, think about it, 1930, the stock market crash, global depression, the third period of the Comintern, and 8 years of fascism in Italy under Benito Mussolini. So from this quite catastrophic context, the most accurate and resonant definition of interregnum in intellectual history emerged. And let's do the famous phrase, quote, "The crisis consists precisely of the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." End of quote. That is one of the most important sentences in political history. The morbid symptoms, what a phrase. The morbid symptoms describe our daily life. This is not about a hegemony. This is not about a war of position. The interregnum is a deathly vacuum. It kills the people. It kills the ideas that enter this space. So do you see why, when I've been configuring this post-endings trilogy, that I've argued that this notion of the end of death, this clean ending, really lies to us. It grants us, however temporarily, however imaginary, this sense of conclusion, so we feel satiated. But you see, life in the interregnum does not give us this sense of conclusion, this peace, this sense that we know what's going on. What the interregnum does is it logs the mess. It logs the instability. It logs violence. It logs confusion. And so while Gramsci wrote about this period from the chaotic time of the late 1920s, the early 1930s in Italy, he also was refashioning, as always happens in the history of ideas, Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich rather than John. And Vladimir Ilyich Lenin used the interregnum to explore what happened with the Russian Revolution. We often forget that there were, of course, two Russian revolutions in 1917. We had February and October, or March and November, depending on your calendar. So the Tsar was overthrown in the February, but the provisional government that was created was not stable. And so the Bolshevik Revolution then emerged through this instability. The meaningfulness of this space, of these 8 months, is incredibly important to log. And some of the greatest scholars of the 20th century spent a lot of time looking at what happened in those 8 months. Now, the legendary, I'm the biggest fan, the legendary Giorgio Agamben, when he was doing his work on the interregnum, used the word suspension a lot. So the interregnum is a suspension of a political, a social, or a legal system. We are anticipating new rules. We're anticipating a new system that never actually arrives. So for the scholars that are inspired by and still working with Antonio Gramsci to this day, the interregnum, you see, it is more than a stopping of a routine. It's more than the destruction of one framework. It's a pause before the next regime arrives, and we don't know if and when that arrival is going to take place. So those of you who know the work that I do with Jean Baudrillard, particularly with leadership, so my double refusal work with leadership, a leader's refusal to lead and people's refusal to be led, that double refusal happens in Interregnum. It's no surprise, therefore, that really some of the greatest scholars of the last 70 years have been drawn to do the difficult work about the Interregnum. And that includes, again, I'm a big Gourley fan, that includes the legendary Zygmunt Bauman, yes, the big Ziggy. And Ziggy found a lot of meaning in the Interregnum when he was doing his work on liquid modernity. So for Ziggy, the financial crisis, globalization, the failures of finance capitalism, the failures of transnationalism signified for him the Interregnum. Now, although through Ziggy's death he was unable to continue the great research he was doing, it is very important for us to continue his legacy and think about, right, September 11, think about the global financial crisis, think about COVID, think about Brexit, think about Trump, think about wars in the Ukraine and in Gaza. And we need to take a breath and sit in that. This time is not in control. Violence, including semiotic violence, attempts to get us organised, intends to make us feel like we know what's going on and that we're all in control and we're not doing anything weird. But you see, that violence, including the semiotic violence, fails. This is a time where we are not in control. So this period is built on an active forgetting of the past, living in this sort of weird and ephemeral present of influences rather than intellectuals, of experience rather than expertise, and of course optics rather than gritty evidence and reality. And the other key scholar who has really influenced my life in the last 15 years, we're dealing with really inspirational, brilliant scholars this week. And one of the truly inspirational scholars from my certainly last 10, 15 years of my life was Wolfgang Streeck. And Streeck described, quote, the return of the repressed, end of quote. He argued that at the moment we're framing these bizarre debates between neoliberals and protectionists. And actually that's a reification of this incredibly dangerous period. He describes this period as an interregnum. He borrows Gramscian interpretations. And you see, what Streeck argues is that too often we reify, we simplify the relationship between neoliberalism and globalisation. And yes, neoliberalism is globalising. But globalisation is much more and much bigger than neoliberalism. And that's why Zizek in particular described the courage of hopelessness. That's significant. So in this interregnum where we don't know what's going on, how do we have momentum? How do we make change? How do we even think? And we have to find that courage in hopelessness. Powerful. And a certain other rather famous scholar that I know through an accident of marriage, of course, Steve Redhead described this period as, quote, dangerous modernity, end of quote. This interregnum for us is a very dangerous one. There's no normal or stable system of government or behaviour. And of course the trouble is we haven't undertaken a proper diagnostic of what is happening in our governments and what is happening in our universities. Why have so many disgusting, horrific, appalling events emerge through the 2010s and the 2020s? Why have so many appalling, cruel, horrific leaders emerged through the 2010s and the 2020s. And we've got used to the dog whistles of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, with all the attendant semiotic violence. You see, in past interregna, great scholars like Gramsci provided the important questions to structure our pathway forward. But our universities right now are deeply troubled. We can't help ourselves, let alone help the citizens we're meant to serve, understand this period. And a lot of this is caused by the absolutely bizarre selection of both vice-chancellors and chancellors in the last 25 years. And this has created a university sector of stretched targets and optics and industry partnerships with people that, let's be honest, should not be allowed to go grocery shopping without a mate. We're also, for some bizarre reason, validating corporate good, corporate goals over the public good. If you think about Scopus and Elsevier and Springer, and we're allowing these corporations to tier journals, create this is what's a valuable journal and this is a less valuable journal. Why have we allowed corporate publishers to validate the tiering of journals? What if we tiered journals on the basis of the exploitation of public money? What if we tiered journals on the degree of exploitation of free academic labour? Interesting, these conversations are not being had. And think about it, in our interregnum, there's so few spaces to think about a knowledge that is not punctuated by finance capitalism or framed by reified vocationalism. The convergence of education and training, which are both very different things, education and training, teaching and learning, knowledge production and knowledge dissemination, means that our universities can't even save ourselves, let alone care for the citizens that we are meant to serve. Now, Anna Korbler, in that great book we talked about last week, Immediacy, or the Style of Too Late Capitalism, argued that, quote, the omni-crisis will not auto-settle, end of quote. I think that's incredibly important. So if we think, oh, look, if we just hang in there, this will get better. No, that's not correct. This stuff will not auto-settle. We have to do something. Indeed, to again summon Gramsci, quote, the old world is dying and the new one struggles to be born. Now is the time for monsters. End of quote. Now is the time for monsters. Is there a better description of our time than this? I don't think so. But it comes from Gramsci, written in prison while he was fighting Benito Mussolini. So why does this interpretation of the interregnum seem so current and resonant and relevant now? Well, as Matamaro has argued, quote, it's a metaphor for the suspended time that characterises our present, end of quote. Isn't that interesting? That sense of suspended time. We're waiting for stuff and nothing emerges. Interesting. So remember, originally when we were talking about the interregnum, it was the time lag between the death of a sovereign and the arrival of the successor. This is a dying order with the new order yet to be born. So this is, and this is quite important, this is a crisis of authority. The ruling class has lost consensus, and so dominance must be maintained by force. The people, the citizens, us, we no longer accept the authority of those in power. We no longer accept the authority of the establishment. So this lack of belief in the traditionally powerful is why at our particular interregnum we've got this really damaging dance between neoliberalism and populism. Anxiety is resulting from this transformation to the status quo, and so what we've got are these multiple crises of institutions, of the state, of politics. What's actually happening is legitimacy is dying. We see this through the absolutely incompetent and underqualified leaders that run our university at the moment. They're running it on this endless short-termism. And of course, if you argue and look at it around the world as I've done, the worst of leaders in international higher education, the worst of vice-chancellors, have really only 3 levers to deploy because they're not outstanding researchers. They've never been outstanding researchers. They're not outstanding teachers. They've never been outstanding teachers. They've only sort of got 3 levers to play with. They restructure, they build a building, and they create a new logo. And that's all they do. So, let's have a restructure. We've done that. It's good. Let's build a building. Let's create a new logo for the institution. And endlessly they cycle through those 3 levers until they finish their term. And those 3 levers exist for a reason, because they're blocking the actual point that a university exists. Our legitimacy comes from our teaching and our research, not restructures, not building buildings, and not the creation of a new logo. But you see, we live in times of monsters. We live in times of fear. What do we do as human beings when we are living through such powerlessness? And I think Morgan Godfrey did some fantastic work on that in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand. And he argued that one answer to that question is, of course, virtue signalling. So identity politics, this is me, and let me just overshare how terribly important I am. Let me tell you about my identity. And so that's when the self becomes quite selfish politics. So virtue signalling becomes big at this point. But also there's quiet quitting, there's despair, the deaths of despair, suicide and fear. People just giving up emotionally, intellectually, or in terms of their bodies. The interregnum, therefore, is not simply about an economic crisis or a political crisis. It is so unstable because it's a crisis of legitimation. Yeah? And that's why we all sort of feel suspended. Bowman argued that, quote, sovereignty is nowadays, so to speak, unanchored and free-floating, end of quote. Wow. So Bowman confirms, he did this probably better than anybody, that we are in a time of waiting. But in this moment of waiting, we can make choices. We can enact change. William Spanos, changed my life, this book, in his remarkable book, The Ethical Imperatives of the Interregnum, stated that, quote, we think backwards, but we live forward. We think backwards, but we live forward. And if you think about it, the greatest scholars of our time, whether it's Alain Badiou, Giorgio Agamben, Louis Althusser, or indeed Zig Bowman, they all lived and worked through this liminality. They had to occupy the space between past and present, thinking and living. And that's what made them spectacular scholars. The question, therefore, is how we think about the end of the world that is not the end of the world. How do we live in the end of the world that's not the end of the world. And really the question of this trilogy for me has been, how do we begin again? Not beginning again from a beginning, not beginning again from an ending. How do we begin again from the middle? I've been incredibly moved by a lot of the reading that I've done for this trilogy, but I have to really focus on Natalie Lovelace's fine 2019 book, How to Make Art at the End of the World. And she states, I get quite emotional, so I apologise if my voice moves a bit, but she states, quote, "Stories are powerful. The stories that we believe, the stories that we live into, shape our daily practices." End of quote. Think about that. The stories that we live into. Wow. So our post-endings trilogy has explored the unproductive, the toxic, the delusional stories that we're all living into shape. The stories of ego, self-importance, how incredibly valuable our lives are, the great legacy we'll have after we die, when of course the truth is simply we all end up dust. And when we die, all the things that we enjoyed, all our shopping, all our consumerism ends up in a skip or a dumpster out the front, and we are forgotten. We're gone. That's the truth. And of course that was our first post in our trilogy. Then of course we emerged with the stories of denial that we have to summon, denial of that truth when we avoid a mirror moment. So we live in sort of the ego and the importance and our great value, rather than looking in the mirror and seeing the fear and the horror and the disappointment and the ugliness and the failure. So most of us are living into shape these Instagram stories of happy holidays, nice families, successful careers, LinkedIn updates, yeah? Whereas actually the mirror moment is required. When we look at ourselves without any of those weird filters and we see the ugliness, we see the disappointment, and we sit in the despair. And of course we've finished our post-endings trilogy by realising that endings aren't really endings. Endings let us off the hook. Endings make us feel better about ourselves. Endings flatter us. They give us that great sense of completion that we know what's going on. Now, of course, there is no conclusion. This is the interregnum. We do not know what's going on, and we don't know what's going to happen next. We are sort of stuck in this messy, confused, complicated, intricate, granular interregnum. Nothing is inevitable, but we still have to make decisions about power, authority, and legitimation. We have to make decisions about the past and about the future. We need an end. We need an idea of an ending to be fluid, to be flexible, so that we can shape that story into meaning to allow us to survive. And you see, these are necessary fictions that we all think into shape. We need this sense of an ending so we can survive the day. So we don't wake up in the morning and go, today is completely pointless, even though it is. So we need those stories of the ending to give us meaning in the middle. But the problem is that this imagining creates an overvaluation of our experience. We assume that what we experience as an individual, a data point of one, what we experience as an individual is generalizable and of great interest to everybody else in our lives. So this results in denialism. We deny the risks of our behaviour, and we more seriously replace reality and fact with emotion. You see, summoning endings lets us off the hook. We can sit in our present and endlessly displace our mirror moment. As Frederick Jameson stated so powerfully, quote, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than imagine the end of capitalism." End of quote. So we shop, we satiate ourselves with stuff. We confuse shopping with living and shopping with thinking. And this version of globalization is not sustainable. We are now in the era of post-growth. As Peter Zeidhan has described it, quote, "We have reached the end of more." End of quote. How strong is that? The end of more. And at this end of more, we all have to recalibrate and reorganize our mattering maps. We won't be able to shop our way to happiness. We won't be able to write our own ending. As T.S. Eliot reminded us, quote, "This is the way that the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper." End of quote. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.